From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This is your Nuremberg moment. Your chance to stand on the right side of history. Justice is not inevitable. It doesn't just happen. And it doesn't stand a chance if people in power, including those at this table, don't make it a priority.
We look at the Trump administration's global attack on women after the U.S. guts a UN Security Council resolution to end rape as a weapon of war, excluding references to sexual and reproductive health. Then, for the second time in a week, a judge has blocked the Trump administration's gag rule that would have stripped federal funding, known as Title X, for Planned Parenthood and other clinics that refer patients for abortion or even mention abortion as an option. We speak with Planned Parenthood's new president, Dr. Leana Wen.
It's ridiculous. It's unethical. It's illegal. And Planned Parenthood will be fighting President Trump and the Trump administration with everything we have.
Then meet the journalists that Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has jailed twice in the past few months.
You cannot harass and intimidate journalists to silence. We'll stand up and fight against it. And as long as we are a democracy under a constitution which has a Bill of Rights, we will demand our rights be respected.
Award-winning journalist Maria Ressa, the founder of the independent news site Rappler, joins us to talk about Duterte's crackdown on press freedom. Ressa and Dr. Leana Wen were both just named among Time 100's most influential people of 2019. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Sri Lanka, government officials have lowered the death toll from the Easter Sunday attacks on churches and hotels to about 253. That's more than 100 lower than the previous estimate. Authorities said there were so many body parts at the bombing sites it was difficult to obtain a precise death toll. More than 500 people were injured. Over the past days, Sri Lanka's top police official and defense secretary have both resigned in response to the government's failure to follow up on warnings that an attack was imminent. In campaign news, former Vice President Joe Biden's recently reached out to Anita Hill prior to entering the presidential race. Biden has long been criticized for his handling of Anita Hill's allegations that now Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her in the workplace. Biden was chair of the all-male, all-white Senate Judiciary Committee in 1991 when Hill testified. He forced Hill to discuss in graphic detail Thomas's sexual comments. He did not invite other women to testify who could have corroborated Hill's allegations. Anita Hill told the New York Times she was not satisfied with Biden's comments during their phone conversation. Hill said, quote, "I cannot be satisfied by simply saying, 'I'm sorry for what happened to you.' I will be satisfied when I know there is real change and real accountability and real purpose," she said. In other campaign news, Biden marked his first day on the campaign trail by attending a $2,800 a person fundraiser in Philadelphia at the home of Compass chief lobbyist David Cohen. Attendees included Daniel Hilferty, chief executive of Independence Blue Cross, the largest health insurer in the Philadelphia area. Senator Bernie Sanders criticized Biden for holding a fundraiser in the home of a corporate lobbyist. Former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell, who co-hosted the Biden fundraiser, appeared on CNN this morning.
For 90% of the people who attended last night's fundraiser, they're contributing against their own financial interest. They'll do better with a Republican president because they're in the top 1%. So they'll do better with a Republican president. It'll probably cost them money if Joe Biden wins because I think he'll bring some sense to the tax cut and he'll probably raise rates on the top 1%. So a lot of these people gave money even though it was against their own financial interest.
In other campaign news, Biden has hired Simone Sanders to be a senior advisor to his campaign. Sanders is a prominent African-American political strategist who served as press secretary for Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders in 2016 when he ran for president. Last month, Simone Sanders donated $250 to the campaign of Pete Buttigieg. In Sudan, hundreds of thousands of protesters gathered outside Sudan's defense ministry Thursday, calling for civilian rule following the recent military coup that ousted Omar al-Bashir. About 100 Sudanese judges joined the protests, chanting, "Civilian, civilian, protected by the judiciary." In a concession to the protesters, 3 prominent Sudanese generals have agreed to resign from the ruling Transitional Military Council. Protesters are vowing to stay in the streets until military rule has ended.
All our demands have been carefully studied, are well known, and we insist on them. We will not leave this sit-in until all our demands are met, at the forefront of which is a civilian government.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has wrapped up his first-ever meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kim criticized the United States for acting in bad faith during his recent nuclear summit with Trump and warned the situation on the Korean peninsula could return to what he described as its original state. On Thursday, Putin said the international community, not just the United States, should be involved in negotiations on North Korea's nuclear program. French President Emmanuel Macron has vowed to cut taxes and increase pensions as part of a package of reforms aimed at quelling the 6-month-old Yellow Vest protests. Macron outlined his proposals in an over 2-hour press conference in which he told French workers they must work harder. More than 40,000 people have died in Venezuela since 2017 as a result of U.S. sanctions. That's the conclusion of a new report by the Center for Economic and Policy Research and the economist Jeffrey Sachs. The report examines how U.S. sanctions have reduced the availability of food and medicine in Venezuela and increased disease and mortality. Jeffrey Sachs said, quote, "American sanctions are deliberately aiming to wreck Venezuela's economy and thereby lead to regime change. It's a fruitless, heartless, illegal, and failed policy causing grave harm to the Venezuelan people," he said. In the second time this week, a federal judge has blocked a new rule that would have stripped federal funding known as Title X for Planned Parenthood and other clinics that refer patients for abortions or even mention abortion as an option. U.S. District Judge Stanley Bastian of Washington State ruled against the changes Thursday, saying they would require clinics, quote, to face a Hobson's choice that harms patients as well as the providers. The judge's ruling halts the so-called gag rule, which was announced by President Trump in February and was scheduled to go into effect May 3rd. This came 2 days after an Oregon judge issued a preliminary injunction to stop the gag rule from going into effect. We'll have more on this later in the program when we speak to the president of Planned Parenthood, Dr. Lena Wen. A federal judge has temporarily blocked a Texas law that bans state contractors from boycotting Israel. Under the law, state contractors are required to sign a pledge vowing not to boycott Israel and not to take any action that is, quote, intended to penalize, inflict economic harm on, or limit commercial relations with Israel, unquote. The bill was widely viewed as an attempt to criminalize support for the BDS movement. That's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. On Thursday, federal judge Robert Pittman issued an injunction saying, quote, the statute threatens to suppress unpopular ideas and manipulate the public debate through coercion rather than persuasion. This, the First Amendment does not allow, he said. Part of the case stems from a lawsuit filed by Bahia Anawi, an Arabic-speaking child language specialist in the Pflugerville Independent School District in Texas. She lost her job of 9 years for not signing the boycott pledge. Bahia Anawi appeared on Democracy Now! Last year explaining why she couldn't sign the pledge.
And I sent an email to my speech coordinator telling her, listen, I cannot sign this. This is against my principles, against my constitutional rights, and it's also against my moral and ethical values, considering that I am a Palestinian American, and I have family that actually live in occupied territory, so it affects me personally as well. So it affects me in both ways as an American citizen and as a Palestinian American, too.
The founder of Pink Floyd, Roger Waters, is at the center of a growing controversy over free speech on college campuses. Waters is scheduled to speak on a panel at the University of Massachusetts Amherst on May 4th about the backlash against pro-Palestinian voices. Other speakers include Palestinian-American activist Linda Sarsour, who has faced death threats for her outspokenness, and Temple University professor Mark Lamont Hill, who was recently fired from CNN for speaking up for Palestinian rights. The event has sparked protests on campus. A group of UMass students filed a lawsuit claiming they will, quote, suffer irreparable harm if the event takes place. The Massachusetts Republican Party and the Massachusetts Jewish Republican Committee have condemned the event, claiming it's anti-Semitic. Another 80 groups have urged UMass to pull its support for the panel. On Thursday, the University of Massachusetts announced the event will go ahead despite the protests, saying it's committed to the principles of free speech and academic freedom. A Coast Guard lieutenant accused of plotting to kill high-profile liberal figures may soon be released from pretrial detention. On Thursday, a federal judge in Maryland said he did not find Christopher Hassan's detention appropriate based on the charges against him. While prosecutors claim Hassan was plotting a domestic terror attack, he's only been charged with gun and drug offenses, not terrorism or attempted murder. At the time of his arrest, Hassan reportedly had a stockpile of 15 guns and more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition. His hit list included House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, civil rights pioneer Angela Davis, freshman Congress members Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, MSNBC host Chris Hayes, and Democratic presidential hopefuls Senators Kirsten Gillibrand, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris, among others. The National Security Agency has quietly recommended that the Trump administration abandon a surveillance program collecting metadata on the phone calls and text messages of hundreds of millions of Americans. The program was launched secretly under President George W. Bush after 9/11 without the approval of federal courts. The secret program's existence was revealed in 2013 by NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. For years, the NSA defended the surveillance as an essential tool to fight terrorism. But the NSA now says the surveillance program is no longer worth the effort needed to maintain it. Snowden responded on Twitter by saying, "First they laugh at you, then they fight you, then they admit you were right all along and maybe shouldn't have been violating everyone else's rights in the first place." A Pentagon ethics investigation has cleared acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan following accusations he unfairly favored the weapons contractor Boeing. Shanahan spent over 3 decades as an executive at Boeing. Calls are growing for the mayor of Baltimore, Maryland, Catherine Pugh, to resign after the FBI and IRS raided her 2 homes and her City Hall office as part of a probe into her business dealings. Part of the probe may center on the mayor making more than $700,000 by selling large quantities of her self-published children's books to businesses with government ties, including the University of Maryland Medical System. Pugh has been on indefinite leave since April 1st. Following the FBI raid, Maryland's Republican Governor Larry Hogan called on her to resign. And in London, climate activists with the group Extinction Rebellion concluded 10 days of civil disobedience Thursday by disrupting the centre of London's financial district. Some activists superglued themselves to the entrance to the British Treasury. Others targeted Goldman Sachs, the London Stock Exchange, and the Bank of England. Over the past 10 days, more than 1,100 activists have been arrested as part of the Extinction Rebellion protests. Among those arrested Thursday was Phil Kingston, who marked his 83rd birthday by climbing onto the roof of a train.
I'm here because I have a belief that there is something greater than us which tells me that we don't own this earth. So I am just not accepting that we treat it as though it is our just property to do with what the heck we like. And it's doing terrible damage. The current economy is now using 1.7 Earths. And we in the human population have been taught that this is the way of life. It isn't. It's a way of death. And that's because the more we take, the less there is for future generations, for the poorest peoples who are already got next to nothing, and the rest are other than human nature, which is as important as we are.
That's Phil Kingston, who marked his 83rd birthday by climbing onto the roof of a train as part of the Extinction Rebellion protests. More than 1,000 people have been arrested over the last 10 days for these protests. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration's under fire after the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution to end rape as a weapon of war on Tuesday that excluded any mention of sexual and reproductive health. The resolution was gutted after the U.S. threatened to veto the measure altogether unless language referencing reproductive health was taken out, due to the Trump administration's belief the language was code for abortion. The watered-down measure also weakened references to the International Criminal Court, making it harder for women and girls to seek justice. France's UN ambassador blasted the move, saying, quote, "It's intolerable and incomprehensible that the Security Council is incapable of acknowledging that women and girls who suffered from sexual violence and conflict and who obviously didn't choose to become pregnant should have the right to terminate their pregnancy." The resolution was championed by Nobel Peace Laureate Nadia Murad, a Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist from Iraq. She was kidnapped by the self-proclaimed Islamic State and held as a sex slave for almost 3 months.
We come here today and ask that those perpetrators of genocide be brought to justice. They used Yazidi women as a weapon of war. Hence, they need to be tried before a special court so that they would be tried for the crimes they committed. Bringing elements of ISIL to justice in the framework of an international tribunal that terrorized them for crimes of genocide and sexual violence against women would send messages to others and prevent such crimes in the future.
And this is human rights attorney Amal Clooney addressing the Security Council on Tuesday.
This is your Nuremberg moment, your chance to stand on the right side of history. You owe it to Nadia and to the thousands of women and girls who must watch ISIS members shave off their beards and go back to their normal lives while they, the victims, never can.
The gutted resolution is just the latest in the Trump administration's hardline stances on UN resolutions. In recent months, they've also opposed using the word gender in UN documents in what is seen as an attack on transgender rights. We're joined now by Jessica Neuwirth, the director of the Human Rights Program at Roosevelt House at Hunter College, the director of the Sisterhood Global Institute. She sent a letter Wednesday to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo protesting the U.S. stance in the Security Council resolution on sexual violence and conflict. Jessica Neuwirth has worked as a consultant to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda on issues of sexual violence in several cases, including a landmark decision recognizing rape as a form of genocide. Jessica Neuwirth, welcome to Democracy Now! So talk about what happened at the United Nations this past week.
Well, I have to say it was really a shameful week for the United States. 10 years ago, it was the United States that pioneered the resolution that created an office to deal with sexual violence and conflict and a special representative of the Secretary General at a very high level. And the goal of the 10-year anniversary resolution was to strengthen the mechanisms and move the agenda forward. And while in the end it did that in some important respects, most of the energy, instead of reinforcing political will, was used to battle this assault by the United States and its continuing threat to veto the resolution, in part because of the language sexual and reproductive health, because of references to the International Criminal Court, all of the mechanisms that actually do strengthen the work of the UN and others around the world to stop sexual violence and conflict. And then, of course, on the sexual and reproductive health, I mean, the services that are most needed by women and girls who have been raped in war zones.
So can you talk about the origins of this resolution that originally Germany put forward, right?
Germany sponsored the resolution, and as I said, it was really designed to move the agenda forward. And we're used to seeing the United States in the UN also try to move these agendas forward. And this time around, what we saw was the United States lining up with China and Russia against its allies, its closest allies like France, Belgium, Germany, the UK, really blocking efforts to get the resolution passed. And it was only because of the really dramatic compromises that were made that the resolution in the end did pass. And as I said, there are some good things in the resolution that we don't want to ignore, but it was really shameful, to be an American walking around the halls of the UN.
So the United States forced the UN Security Council to remove the words sexual and reproductive health, to which people like the French ambassador was outraged in response, saying this is just unacceptable.
It was a rare moment for ambassadors to be openly voicing that kind of disappointment. The UN is a very diplomatic place, but following the passage of the resolution, not only the French, but the South Africans, the Belgians, the British really spoke very strongly.
Let me go to the British. The United Kingdom Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict, Tariq Ahmad, addressed the United Nations Security Council Tuesday.
We regret that the language on services for survivors of sexual violence, recognizing the acute need for those services to include comprehensive reproductive and sexual health care, including safe termination of pregnancies, did not meet with all the Council members' support. However, Mr. President, it is important that we maintain our consistent efforts in this respect, and we maintain that progress that we have made on this issue.
And this is the French ambassador to the United Nations, François Delattre, also speaking Tuesday.
In the face of certain threats, I would still like to underscore how essential it is for France and in the name of victims to ensure that these victims can have access to sexual and reproductive health. This is an essential point.
That was the voice of the translator, Jessica Neuwirth.
Yes, and the South African ambassador, I would say, went even further and noted the hypocrisy of adopting a survivor-centered approach, which was one of the wonderful things about this resolution, that it really tried to put survivors at the center of all efforts to combat sexual violence and conflict, and yet at the same time denying them the services or our right to access services that are so vitally needed. So I think what he said was that the message to survivors is the consensus in the UN is more important than their needs, despite the fact that the UN had just said that their needs should be central to any effort.
Now, this is non-binding, but talk about the effects of this on the ground. You've long worked on these issues of sexual violence and what it means to address sexual and reproductive health.
Well, the most important thing, which is true for all of these resolutions, many of which have really important and great ideas in them, is to see them get implemented. And so I think how it will play out on the ground is actually going to depend on how much political will there really is to implement these mechanisms that exist, even though we weren't able to create more mechanisms. I think one of the important things in the new resolution is greater support for sanctions for perpetrators. So I think we have to see, are these perpetrators actually going to be sanctioned, and can we use the existing tools, which by and large have not been effective to date, not because they can't be effective, but because they just haven't been used properly. So I think that what the survivors said, or what Dr. Mukwege, who works closely with survivors, and Nadia Murad said. And
Dr. Mukwege, of course, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, together with Nadia Murad, are both this year's Nobel Peace Prize winners. Well, the award given in 2018, and both attended this hearing.
They both attended. They both spoke very strongly on behalf of survivors and the need for justice. And so I think what matters the most in the end is what happens after. You know, are these just empty words and a battle over words, or can we really move forward with what is in the resolution, honor the survivors, and support them in many ways, including with sanctions and efforts to bring the perpetrators to justice? Another important point in the resolution that's new is a focus, and for the first time, a mention of children born of rape. Around the world in these conflict zones, there are children born of rape who face many particular problems, and there is a report coming out, thanks to this resolution, that will focus on their needs and their issues.
And your letter to Secretary of State Pompeo?
I wrote to Secretary Pompeo in a moment of tremendous frustration because it was just horrifying to watch this destructive effort, which at various points in time seemed like it really could torpedo the entire resolution, which was only saved because of the major compromises that were made that were so disturbing to so many of us. And so I just pointed out that the United States had an authorship role in all of this work, and that it was such a reversal. And I think we have to remember the context. These are girls and young women who are being raped by ISIS terrorists or Boko Haram, and the first thing they need is reproductive health care. And if they become pregnant, the idea that they would be forced to carry to term that pregnancy from rape, caused by rape, has been found by the United Nations in other fora to constitute a form of torture.
It can't help but note that President Trump, right, the world leader who is pushing this forward and taking out references to sexual or reproductive health, himself has been accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault by at least 16 women.
I think the insensitivity, that's probably a kind word, the insensitivity of the administration to the needs in general of women, even here in this country, but in particular, again, the sort of dire circumstances of these women who are facing the most brutal mass rapes is really just, it leaves me speechless.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Last question. You were sitting right behind Nadia Murad at the UN Security Council hearing. The Murad rule that the UK is expected to launch the Murad Code.
The UK has been a real leader in efforts to raise attention and awareness to the issue of sexual violence and conflict and to come up with various codes of conduct and remedial mechanisms. So I think that effort will be continuing. There's a big conference later this year.
Well, we'll certainly cover that. Jessica Neuwirth, want to thank you for being with us. Director of Human Rights Program at Roosevelt House of Hunter College, also the director of Sisterhood's Global Institute, and sent a letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo protesting the U.S. stance on the Security Council resolution on sexual violence in conflict. Jessica Neuwirth has worked as a consultant to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda on issues of sexual violence in several cases. I want to thank you so much for being with us. When we come back, we're going to get response from Dr. Lena Wen, who is the new president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and also talk with her about the Title X rulings that have come down this week. We'll talk about the gag rule and the global gag rule. Stay with us.
Why you wanna fly, blackbird? You ain't ever gonna fly. Why you wanna fly, blackbird? You ain't ever gonna fly. No place big enough for holding. All the tears you're gonna cry. 'Cause your mama's name was lonely, and your daddy's name was
Blackbird by Nina Simone. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to the new president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Dr. Lena Wen, she was just honored by Time magazine this week as one of Time 100, the most influential people of 2019. Before we talk about Title X, I wanted to get your response, Dr. Wen, to what just took place at the UN Security Council, a resolution that was passed 13-0 on sexual violence against women, rape against people in war zones. But the U.S. gutting that resolution, taking out any reference to sexual and reproductive health.
I have treated women who were infected with HIV as a result of rape during the war. I've helped women who were the victims of sexual torture with clubs and bayonets and had fistulas and required life-saving support. What we need to do for these women who are victims of war and horrific situations is to provide them with the care that they need. And excluding sexual and reproductive health care undermines their ability to get that care. It's time for us as the U.S. to value women's rights as human rights. And what this Trump-Pence administration has consistently shown globally and in the U.S. is that they do not value women's lives. And the policies that they are championing are, frankly, oppressive. They counter best practices when it comes to public health. And frankly, they are misogynistic.
Well, I want to turn to the Trump administration's attack on reproductive rights here in the United States. A second federal judge has blocked a gag rule that would have stripped federal funding known as Title X for Planned Parenthood and other clinics that refer patients for abortion or even mention abortion as an option. The judge's ruling halts the gag rule, which was announced by President Trump in February and was scheduled to go into effect May 3rd. Washington State federal judge Stanley Bastian ruled against the changes to Title X funding Thursday, saying they would require clinics to face a Hobson's choice that harms patients as well as the providers. This came 2 days after an Oregon judge issued a preliminary injunction to stop the gag order from going into effect, calling the rule a ham-fisted approach to public health policy. Oregon federal judge Michael McShane said, quote, "At the heart of these rules is an arrogant assumption that the government is better suited to direct women's health care than their providers," he said. Title X covers non-abortion services like STD prevention, cancer screenings, contraception, provides over $280 million in funding for 4 million, mostly low-income women every year. Talk about the significance of what happened this week in 2 states, 2 federal judges saying no to the Trump administration, and what the Trump administration is trying to do with this gag order that was supposed to go into effect next week. Dr. Wen.
What the Trump administration is trying to do with this gag rule is to prevent doctors from fulfilling our ethical obligation. When I became a doctor, I took an oath that I would always provide honest, full, and accurate information to my patients. To restrict what I can say, to have the Trump administration or any politician telling me what I can and cannot say to my patients is just unethical, unconscionable, and frankly, unthinkable. This is the reason why over 100 medical, nursing, public health groups, including the American Medical Association, American Nurses Association, American Public Health Association, have stood up in strong opposition to this Title X gag rule, because we know that it would force us to compromise the oath that we took to serve our patients, and also that it would not happen for any other aspect of healthcare. I mean, how ludicrous would it be if doctors now cannot tell our patients who come for insulin and who have diabetes, if we cannot tell them about where they can go to get insulin, a life-saving and life-changing treatment. And so this ruling is important because it is a preliminary injunction that blocks this gag rule from taking effect. It also continues to allow Planned Parenthood and other health centers to continue serving millions of patients around the country who depend on us for primary and preventive services. As you said, Amy, Title X provides for affordable birth control, breast and cervical cancer screenings, STI treatment, HIV testing. In many parts of the country, this is the only way that individuals with low income who live in rural areas are able to get access to health care. And taking that away, we know the consequence, which is that people are going to delay getting health care. Cancers are going to end up getting diagnosed later. There will be increased rates of STIs and unintended pregnancies. That's what happens when people cannot get the reproductive health care that they need.
So, again, give us the scenario. A woman comes into your office and she says, what are my options if this gag rule were in effect, if she's just learned that she was pregnant? You as a doctor would not be able to even say, forget referring her somewhere or to a Planned Parenthood clinic even. You couldn't even say your options are keeping the baby or terminating the pregnancy. You couldn't say terminating the pregnancy, abortion?
Well, here's the thing. Congress has made it very clear by passing laws about it before that physicians and nurses and providers must be able to provide the full range of options, because that's what medicine is about. It's not up to me as the doctor to tell my patients what they should do. My obligation is to provide all the information and empower my patients to make the best decisions for themselves. Under this gag rule, if a patient came to me and I work at a clinic that receives Title X federal funding, I would not even be able to provide a referral to a woman, even if she specifically asking for a referral for abortion care. And it's not even clear what I would be allowed to do if it's medically necessary in order to save her health, if she has a life-threatening condition, a condition that threatens her health, if I'm able to make a referral in that case. And I want to point out not only how unethical this is, but also how discriminatory it is too. Because this is saying that if you are a person who's wealthy, if you have private insurance, you can still go to your doctor and get accurate medical information and the healthcare that you need. But if you are a woman of low income, if you are a family with low income, not only can you not get healthcare access, but you would not even be able to get accurate information from your doctor. This is just one more example from the Trump-Pence administration of a discriminatory policy that would worsen health outcomes and worsen disparities for those who already face disproportionate barriers to care. It will, the people who receive Title X are those who are uninsured, those who live in out-of-the-way rural areas. It's people of color. It's people who already face these barriers. And it also puts providers into an impossible position because either you continue to serve patients or you're forced to compromise your ethics. And from our standpoint in Planned Parenthood, we cannot accept these gagged funds. We would never force our doctors to censor themselves. We would never provide care to our patients that's anything less than full, accurate, honest, the same compassionate, high-quality, non-judgmental care that we provide through our 600 health centers across the country now.
I wanted to ask about the global gag rule. Shortly after his inauguration in January 2017, President Trump reinstated this controversial global gag rule, the policy originating in the Reagan era, banning U.S. funding for any international health care group that performs abortion, advocates for the legalization of abortion, or even mentions it, even if those activities are funded by non-U.S. money. Then White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer commented on that decision.
Well, I think the president, it's no secret, has made it very clear that he's a pro-life president. He wants to stand up for all Americans, including the unborn. And I think the reinstatement of this policy is not just something that echoes that value, but respects taxpayer funding as well, and ensures that we're standing up not just for life for the unborn, but for also taxpayer funds that are being spent overseas to perform an action that is contrary to the values of this president. And I think continue to further illustrate, not just to the folks here in this country, but around the world, of what a value we place on life.
So that's a familiar voice to many, though no longer there, the former press spokesperson for President Trump, Sean Spicer. Dr. Lena Wen, what this means globally, and also for the many groups, explain Planned Parenthood Federation of America's role globally.
Well, I just have to point out the hypocrisy here, because if we truly were to value life, we would be looking to expand access to healthcare, not gut it. Let's look right here in the U.S. as an example. We have rising maternal mortality right here in the U.S. American women are 50% more likely to die in childbirth than our mothers were. We're the only industrialized country where maternal mortality is going up. African-American women in the U.S. are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth and thereafter than white women. A woman in Georgia is 10 times more likely to die in childbirth than a woman in California. Look at what this administration is trying to do right here in the U.S., which is cutting healthcare access, taking away access to birth control, taking away and sabotaging the Affordable Care Act that provides care to women, that also allows for women to receive care in pregnancy, gutting, dismantling Medicaid that provides care to low-income women, families, and children. I mean, there's huge hypocrisy right here in the U.S. But that hypocrisy we've seen time and time again, and actually first with this Trump-Pence administration's policies globally. One of the first things that this administration did was to reinstate and expand the global gag rule. And we've already seen the impact of this gag rule because they have taken away funding from clinics, health centers, organizations that even offer information about abortion care and the full spectrum of reproductive health care, which is what abortion is. Abortion is a standard medical procedure that's part of the full spectrum of reproductive health care. And for many people, it is life-saving. It is a critical procedure. It is a critical part of modern medicine. We've seen what happens when people internationally do not have access to safe, legal abortions. Actually, 1/10 of maternal mortality globally is due to unsafe abortions. 30,000 women die every year around the world because they do not have access to safe, legal abortions. And by the Trump-Pence administration imposing a global gag rule, not only are they worsening maternal mortality globally in the U.S., what they're also doing, too, is to take away funding from organizations that provide care for patients with HIV/AIDS, that look to prevent STIs and HIV worldwide. And there are health centers and clinics and organizations that have had to close their doors around the world that provide food and nutrition assistance to families, that provide care to individuals with HIV infection. And what this Trump-Pence administration is doing is worsening health. And so I find it extremely hypocritical that they get to call themselves pro-life when what they are doing is worsening health outcomes and leading to more people dying in the U.S. and around the world.
I want to go beyond Trump's gag rule, just the latest in a series of attacks on reproductive rights here in the United States, as 28 states, more than half the states, consider legislation to ban or restrict abortion in various ways. Among the slew of strategies are trigger bans to make abortion completely illegal in a state should Roe v. Wade be overturned, and 6-week abortion bans. Earlier this month, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine signed into law a 6-week abortion ban, what some call the fetal heartbeat bill. It bans abortions once a fetal heartbeat can be detected, something that typically happens just 6 weeks into a pregnancy before many women even realize they're pregnant. The bill does not include exceptions for cases of rape or incest. A similar law set to take effect in Mississippi in July, while judges have for now blocked these 6-week bills from going into effect in Kentucky and Iowa. Can you talk more about this? And I know that you at Planned Parenthood don't like to refer to these 6-week abortion bans as fetal heartbeat bills, and if you can explain why.
Well, I'm a doctor and a scientist, and I have to call it as it is. And what it is, what these bills are essentially a ban on all abortions, because at 6 weeks, most women don't even know that they're pregnant. And we've seen this year 16 states introduce bans on abortions as early as 6 weeks. And we need to call out how extreme these bans are. The bill that passed in Georgia is expected to be signed by the governor any day now, allows the state to investigate women for miscarriages. In Alabama, there is a bill that would impose a Class A felony on doctors, sentencing doctors who perform abortions to up to 99 years in prison. There was a bill in Texas that failed, but that bill would impose a death penalty, capital punishment, the death penalty for women who seek abortion care. And more than 300 people came to testify in favor of this bill that would impose the death penalty on women. If there's any doubt about what's happening around the country, we just have to look at the legislation that's been introduced this year and what politicians, these anti-women's health politicians, are saying about it. They are saying blatantly, boldly, that what they're trying to do is to overturn Roe versus Wade. They want for these extreme bills to make their way up to the Supreme Court to overturn Roe. And that's what's at stake here. What's at stake is the right to safe, legal abortions. And we know what happens when that right is taken away because we have the examples around the world, and we know what happened in the U.S. pre-Roe, which is that thousands of women died. And we cannot go back to that time. And that's why Planned Parenthood is fighting back with everything that we have. We are opposing these rules. We've fought back many of these bad bills. And we're also working with our champions across the country to protect and expand the right to reproductive health care. Because we know that reproductive health care and women's health care must be treated as what they are, which is health care, and that the vast majority of the American people support women making their own health care decisions, not politicians telling women and families what we should be doing with our health and our bodies.
Dr. Leana Wen, we want to thank you so much for being with us, president of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America and the Planned Parenthood Action Fund, first physician to lead the organization in nearly 50 years, also the first Asian American and first immigrant ever to hold that office. When we come back, we'll spend the remainder of the hour with the award-winning Filipino journalist Maria Ressa, founder of the independent news site Rappler, a vocal critic of the Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, who's just imprisoned her twice. Like Dr. Leana Wen, Maria Ressa was just honored by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. This is Democracy Now! Back with Maria Ressa in a minute.
You can ask anybody here, if I allowed a policeman to kill a human being kneeling down, or their ancestral insurrection. But I've always told you that if you have to shoot them dead.
Mga anak, salamat sa lahat, lalo na sa pagpapatakbo ng alamat. Kontra droga ang pamagat, kamaong nakangarat ang pabalat. Para sa kaayusan, para sa kaunlaran, para sa kapayapaan. Ano ba naman ang kamatayan ng mga salot na lagot? Kayo nang bahala kung paano ang galaw. Matayog ang pangako, mababa ang tanaw. Tira ng tiragang walang matira. Bubusala ng mga magbibida. Bala ang batas, bala ang pitaka, bala ang balitang di makilala. Ito'y digmaan, ito ang pasinaya. Mga anak, kayo ang makinarya. At sa pagsupil ng mga salutan, lipunan, mag-aalalahanin ng kanilang karapatan. Ang nakasalita sa magiging
Maquinaria, Machinery by the Filipino rap duo Sandata. They'll be playing at the People's Forum in New York on May 4th. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we spend the remainder of the hour with award-winning Filipina journalist Maria Ressa, the founder of the independent news site Rappler, vocal critic of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. Ressa has been arrested twice in recent months by the Philippines government as Duterte cracks down on critics and the media. In February, she was detained in a cyber libel case that's widely seen as politically motivated. She was arrested again in late March for allegedly violating a ban on foreign media ownership. Duterte has long attempted to shut down the Rappler, which has published groundbreaking work on Duterte's deadly so-called war on drugs that's killed thousands of people. Duterte's repeatedly described the site as fake news.
You are a fake news outlet, and I am not surprised that your articles are also fake.
Duterte has also called reporters who ask him tough questions spies and warned that, quote, just because you're a journalist, you are not exempted from assassination. While Duterte's government has attempted to silence Maria Ressa, her journalism has been praised around the world. In December, she was honored as one of Time magazine's Persons of the Year in 2018, and just this week named one of Time's 100 most influential people of 2019. On Wednesday, she won the 2018 Tully Free Speech Award at the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. We are joined by Maria Ressa right now. Congratulations on everything that you've accomplished. I'm not going to say congratulations for going to jail, though it might be a badge of honor, because clearly what Duterte is doing is attacking you for representing the press in the Philippines. But talk about why he put you in jail twice in the last months.
I think it's just to let us... So I was arrested twice in about 5 weeks and detained once. And, you know, I have to say, I think it's just to make sure that I feel the power of the state. It's something that the pace of all of this has been unprecedented, and I've covered the Philippines for more than 30 years. In 14 months, we've had 11 cases filed by the Philippine government. I've posted bail 8 times, and then it just keeps coming. We're going to face every single one in court, and I could face decades in jail if we lose them. And one of the things that always, it just hit me a few days ago that since January 2018, when we've really begun facing all of this, we have not won one single motion
Not one, regardless of how ridiculous the cases are.
Explain what he's charging with you. What's this foreign ownership issue, the tax issue?
So I think you have to look at the whole thing, and it's about 3 years long now. It's preceded by attacks on social media, astroturfing, right? It's fake, they seed it, it grows, and people think it's real. And the first attack is that was actually by pro-Duterte bloggers saying that, random question by one of the ones who became a government official underneath, she headed social media for the presidential palace. Her first question was, is Rappler CIA? It begins there. And then what's seeded is that Rappler is foreign funded. The actual case is that we're controlled by foreigners. So ludicrous, precisely because even in the Philippines, we're known for our independence. The thing that's most alarming for me, though, is the fast pace of something called the cyber libel charge. In this one, a story we published 7 years ago, before the actual cyber libel law was enacted, is being used against us to say we violated the law that didn't exist yet. I don't know how else to, when I first saw it, I laughed. The National Bureau of Investigation, its own lawyers threw it out, and yet a week later it's resuscitated, and now it's in court.
I want to go to what happened when you were just released from jail, just this small clip.
You cannot harass and intimidate journalists to silence. We'll stand up and fight against it. And as long as we are a democracy under a constitution which has a Bill of Rights, we will demand our rights be respected.
So what happens to you when you are detained? And have you dealt directly with Duterte, the president of the Philippines?
I have. I mean, the last interview I did with him was December of 2016. And the interview that I did with him in October 2015 actually helped bring him to the attention, helped the critics of President Duterte point out that Rappler, because we covered him fairly, actually helped him get elected. Certainly he knew the power of Rappler, our millennial demographic, and that's perhaps part of the reason that we're under attack. But I think there's something far more insidious that's happening now. It's normalizing these attacks. You know, when you say 1,000,000 times that I'm a criminal, even though it's not true, people begin to believe. And that's what happened first on social media. The attacks became normal, and then people who had never met me then began to believe it. Then, a year and a half later, when President Duterte comes down and says, you know, Rappler is owned by foreigners, the cases began a week later, and we're sandwiched there. It's a tough place to push back, but I think it's truly important to do that because this is the time. I think this is a pivotal moment for Philippine democracy. This is the time when we have to fight for the rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution. We have elections coming up, May 13th, and if we lose an independent Senate, I think it's only a matter of time before the Philippines gets a new Constitution.
What does that mean if you lose an independent Senate?
A lot of things that have been, we've had a Senate that's been able to block certain things like the formation, like a new...
So not the same party as Duterte?
Yes. There were enough opposition votes that they were able to stop a new constitution being ratified. Right, so our House of Representatives, Congress is essentially a rubber stamp now, and the Senate in the past was holding the line. Now it looks like we're slated to bring in an administration Senate in the May 13th, on May 13th, in a few weeks' time. If that happens, it'll only be a matter of time before the House passes a new constitution, parliamentary in nature, federalism, which is something that President Duterte wants. Not saying that federalism is not democracy, but this particular draft will fundamentally change our democracy. So for Filipinos watching, this is our last chance. You know, we may no longer be a democracy in the way that we know it.
So you have Duterte saying, just because you're a journalist, you're not exempted from assassination. What gives you the courage to keep taking him on?
I don't really look at it as taking him on. You know, I do a job. My job is to hold power to account. Rappler, we do stories that the president, lots of people don't like our stories. President Aquino didn't like our stories. But that is the task of what a reporter does, right? So his rhetoric is noise for me. And while it does send a signal to the government bureaucracy, certainly the cases were triggered by President Duterte, it shouldn't stop us. And certainly we shouldn't allow harassment, intimidation, and the fear of that stop you from doing your job. So as far as I'm concerned, we keep going until the Constitution is changed, if that's the case, right? We demand the rights that are guaranteed not just by the Philippine Constitution, but by the Bill of Rights. We have a Constitution similar to the United States.
Rappler is known for exposing the so-called war on drugs, but where thousands of Filipinos have been killed.
Can I correct how much? It's not just thousands, and this is Michelle Bachelet at the UN who used this number. The latest estimate is since July 1, 2016 until early this year, more than 27,000 people killed. That's a UN estimate, right? The Philippine police will admit they've killed more than 5,000 people. Even that number is huge. But there's another bucket that they go off. It's more than 30,000 homicide cases under investigation. This parsing of the details allows lies to continue.
And explain who is being killed. I mean, President Duterte himself has boasted about murdering people.
He has, and before he even became president, in an interview with me, John Oliver wound up running this. He admitted he killed people, that he killed 3 people, and that he would continue. You know, another phrase that was used often is that when I'm elected, if I'm elected, the fish in Manila Bay will be fat, because you'll throw dead bodies in Manila Bay, right? That was the implied statement there. These are not the drug dealers who are being killed. These are the poor people. These are in the poorest of the poor areas. And this is also where you can see in statistical surveys support in this demographic has waned for President Duterte. The people who cannot defend themselves. The people who are on a list, a random list that is not backed. There is no trial. There's no proof that the people being killed are even drug dealers. I think this is dangerous. In a country that has no rule of law, that normalizes extrajudicial killings, we have to demand better.
And President Trump, his support of President Duterte, how does that affect policy in the Philippines? How does it affect you?
Well, when President Trump called CNN and the New York Times fake news, a week later, President Duterte called Rappler fake news. I think it is a bad time for the world when the former beacon of democracy, the fighter for press freedom and human rights, is noticeably absent. And I think you're feeling that all around the world. Simultaneous to that, though, is the American technology companies that have allowed cheap armies on social media to roll back democracy, a new weapon used against journalists. This is psychological warfare, right? And when you're
holding
attacked,
up your phones.
Yeah, when you're attacked. At one point, I was getting 90 hate messages per hour. Per hour. You can't even, it's a whole new thing. So anyway, how do we deal with it? We continue doing our jobs. We demand accountability. We tell our people. And I think the problem, though, is that I think maybe same in the United States is in the Philippines, fear is palpable. And if it's not fear, it's apathy. People want to duck until this time period is over. And I think...
Well, you clearly aren't. And I want to thank you so much for being here. 5 seconds, a message to the world about the importance of press freedom.
Press freedom is not just for journalists. I think this is a critical time for democracy around the world, both in the Philippines and in the United States. And you must fight for your rights while you still can.
Maria Ressa, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Founder, CEO, executive editor of Rappler, an acclaimed Philippines news website, has been arrested twice in recent months. I'll be speaking Saturday night at UC Berkeley, 6 o'clock. Check our website on the occupation of Western Sahara. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.